Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Health Show here only on the Islam Channel with me, Alistair Greena. Tackling health problems every week, we're joined by a health expert within their specialised field who discusses the prevention of health issues or concerns that we or our loved ones may face. Looking at how you can change your health and lifestyle for the better, the Health Show offers an alternative viewpoint from our health experts who attend the show. And we really hope that this will help guide you in the right direction. So if you suffer from any medical issues or have any health concerns, or for that matter, if you know anyone who does, then tune in each week as we'll be covering a wide range of topics and offering alternative viewpoints from our health experts. Now, today, we're looking at violence and assaults of a sexual nature. And to discuss such a sensitive topic, we've invited Nurse Rashida Namasisi, who has been a senior nurse at the Havens for the past 8 years. Now, Havens is a sexual assault referral centre, and there are 3 Havens in the covering area of the Metropolitan Police, and it's great to have Nurse Rashida with us here today. Hello.
Hello, nice to meet you.
We've got lots to talk about, and it's a really important but very sensitive subject, so thank you so much indeed for coming in. But before we talk more with Nurse Rashida, let's watch a short clip that really highlights this particular problem.
There was a wedding at my brother's place. We all were busy. The girl went to fetch water, and during that time, he came and took the girl in a car. After that, he raped her. As soon as we found out, we went running to his home. We found out that it was rape, and decided to take action the next day. We went to the Sarpanch and asked them to at least call the police, as he has power. If we do it, there will be a dispute, and they won't let us succeed.
The district police, after the investigation, has arrested 1 suspect. The search for the other 2 is going on, and we hope that we can catch them soon.
And as Rashida, we've just seen some really disturbing stories there, and it is really a problem, but how much of a problem is it, say, within the UK, within London, and for that matter, further afield?
People don't realise that sexual violence is actually happening very commonly on a day-to-day basis. And I think what really highlights from that video is it sort of reflects that people actually, maybe it's underspoken about. People don't talk about it the way they should really be talking about it. People don't voice their concerns about sexual assault. People are afraid to voice their concerns about sexual assault. Whereas we know that sexual violence does happen to all ages. Sexual violence does happen to young children, men and women, people of all genders, pretty much.
And let's look at the community that will probably be watching this. How does the BAME community compare with other communities? You know, here in Britain, we have so many different cultures, people from so many different ethnicities and backgrounds. How well does the BAME community deal with this particular issue?
I think personally, obviously being a Muslim personally as well, we do find that there is a lot of culture sensitivity around this, and I think what we find that in our communities we tend to want to manage things within the community. We don't tend to want it to spread outside. Now, a lot of the reasons for that, obviously, like I said, stigma, shame. So who are you going to disclose to? And a lot of the times you find that some of these acts that are happening are within family, say for example, fathers, cousins. So it's within the family, it's who you know, but actually the reasons why some of the people in our community probably will not come out to talk about it is the belief, who is going to believe me? And I think sometimes we get bombarded into the fact that we think it's the norm and not talked about. So a lot needs to be talked about within that aspect.
And that's exactly what we're going to do today, because
Totally.
hopefully we will be able to help people who are watching, who
Yeah.
may be either victims or aware of other people who are victims,
Yeah.
to know that there is actually help out there.
Indeed.
And there isn't, as you suggest, any need to be reluctant about going for help.
100%.
Let's get to real basics first of all. We talked about the topic being, violence and assaults of a sexual nature.
Yeah.
What exactly do we mean by that?
So this topic is broad, like I probably said earlier. It's quite broad. So when I say violence and abuse of the sexual nature, it means we're talking about something, unwanted sexual activity, not necessarily sexual activity, but it goes widely from rape to as far as sexual touching. So, and by so saying, we're talking about consent, an act without someone's consent.
Consent, I mean, that's the real key word, isn't it?
It's the real key
If it's
word.
unwanted, if you haven't given your consent
Yes.
for any form of sexual activity, then that is not allowed. And we actually have laws in the UK to cover that, don't we?
Oh, totally. And so many websites will sort of highlight what exactly they mean by consent. And I think this is why sometimes if people don't understand exactly where the boundaries lie, people need to call the helplines out there to actually say, this is what's happened to me. Does this fall within that category of outside consent? Because people don't know.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
many cultures are very different. They're very diverse, as we enjoy here in Britain so much. But the challenge is that some of those cultures are very different.
Yeah.
And the definition of culture, like for some people, maybe being married, being in a long-term
That's right.
relationship might mean an automatic consent, but doesn't necessarily mean that.
And that's very interesting, because actually people don't realize that there is rape in marriages. People don't realize that actually now there is a law that actually says rape in marriages is illegal, because people then just carry on, because it's almost like the norm, because someone or your partner needs to have, or it's their duty to be given that satisfaction, so that it has to happen. And people don't realize, actually, they don't know the difference between, well, they don't know the boundaries, actually. Where does it stop? Where is consent not given, and where is
Yeah.
not consent not given? So there's those dynamics that really.
And how do we compare in the UK? First of all, tell us the laws that this is covered by in the UK. And then beyond that, other countries, we have a very international audience here. So are there those kind of protections in most countries?
So we know that the Sexual Offences Act 2003 covers a lot of the dynamics of rape, and it really gives a good definition of rape and what's what about rape and sexual violence. So the definition is there clearly. But we know that other countries, obviously, different countries have different laws about the rape. So we can't give examples about, because you would find that within different countries, rape would be dealt with differently. However, being the fact that this is watched nationally or internationally, I think the fact still stands that if someone has been subject to this sort of act of violence, that they should be in position to seek help, that it actually does exist, and there's professionals out there who are willing to listen.
We're going to talk a little bit more in a while about what you can do if you feel you might be a victim, if you're in any doubt whatsoever.
Totally.
But I really want to sort of drive down into the detail of this whole consent, who's vulnerable. I mean, for example, are there areas of the community, are there people or individuals who are more vulnerable to some form of sexual violence or assault?
So obviously sexual assault will, I won't necessarily say it will vary. Like I said earlier on at the beginning of the show, that sexual assault can happen to anyone. It can happen to all ages. It can happen to children. It can happen to young children as far as toddlers are concerned. It could happen to adults. It could happen to elderly people as well. So in terms of...
It's interesting, you were leading on to what I was just about to ask, actually, talking about consent, because one of the challenges, and often it makes us feel, any form of sexual violence or assault is upsetting, but it almost seems particularly upsetting when we're looking at the most vulnerable members of our society.
Totally.
When we
Yeah.
look at children, when we look at maybe older people, people who don't feel they have a voice or maybe just don't have a voice.
You're right.
You know, how we can protect them, because, of course, we might not be aware. I mean, what are some of the signs that maybe people can be looking out for within their younger members of the family and things, that maybe something isn't quite right, that maybe there is some form of assault taking place, but it isn't as open because no one's able to talk about it?
Indeed. And I think going back slightly on the question you asked prior to this one is sometimes people don't realize that regardless of whether someone has got a condition or someone has got some sort of mental health illness or something along those lines, it doesn't mean that actually their consent is invalid. Do you see what I mean? So people don't realize that actually, be it an illness, be it the fact that you're not well, it doesn't mean that it justifies your consent or your need, what's the word I'm looking for? So consent is consent, be it whichever illness that someone is suffering from. So,
and despite what you feel might be your right and what you might feel is
That's
you
right.
need to be
that's right.
satisfied with
Yeah.
things. And I think that's the biggest issue, isn't it? When you have the two sides here, where you've got one person with their viewpoint and somebody else with another. And I really want to go on to now in terms of spotting it. We talked a bit about consent.
That's right.
Anything that isn't consensual is therefore some form of assault or violence. And there's a lot of help available out there.
There is help, yes.
Give us a bit of an outline of, if somebody's uncertain, sometimes it's really obvious. Somebody
Yes.
knows this is absolutely wrong, this is absolutely not right.
Yeah.
But if someone's a little concerned, they're not too sure, and they don't want to embarrass themselves, they don't want to put themselves in a difficult position, who can they talk to completely confidentially to ascertain whether or not they should be proceeding any further with what's happened?
So obviously, talking from the Haven background and talking to the audience out there who don't realize that actually where people think that there is a grey area where is this consensual or non-consensual, should I be reporting, should I be talking to someone about it, I would say pick up the phone and speak to the experts, because at the end of the day, we believe every account that comes through. We are health professionals, we're there to believe everyone, and at the end of the day, really, it's happened to one individual. There's no point invalidating someone's decision of how they feel about an act that has happened to them. So we say, pick up the phone, call the helplines that are there. There's no right or wrong question out there. Ask every question that you feel is going to help you, and then we can give you all the answers.
And I think that's the real key, isn't it? Being able to speak to an expert, someone who's heard it all before.
Indeed.
You're not going to shock them. And again, if you want any contact, just let us know here at Islam Channel, and we'll put you in contact with any of those charities, including Haven, who actually will help you, because it's really important that people get in contact if you have any doubt whatsoever about anything. If you're made to feel in the least bit uncomfortable by anything that's happened to you, is get in contact. And I really want to come back to this thing about the most vulnerable members of our society again, because children are often more reluctant. They are, you know, there's all sorts of things going on in their minds to do with guilt and to do with trust and so on. What are the signs that you should spot or you might notice within a younger person or a vulnerable person that something isn't quite right and maybe there's something terrible going on?
Because one of the things that usually happens with youngsters, you find that with youngsters, sexual violence or assault is not going to happen from a total stranger. Most of the time it's going to happen from people they know, acquaintances, family members. But often what they usually do is there's signs of withdrawal. These children, you'll find that they will withdraw from their colleagues. They will not talk about it. And other signs could be not going to school, skipping school, not being in position to actually eat, because some of them even feel dirty, that they don't want to carry on with life. A lot of the times you find that some of them will self-harm as a result of actually releasing off the anger.
Now,
So-
obviously, they're not going to respond if you just say, is someone abusing you? So
Totally.
how do you broach that subject? And maybe it might be easier if you maybe give us an example of how someone you've managed to find out that something's terrible is going on through different questioning, through different things. And again, obviously, experts will guide you in that. But maybe you could give us a scenario where somebody has been able to broach that subject and what actually happened.
Because what would happen usually, one of the examples is if someone attends to a service, 3/4 of the time, perhaps something has been happening prior to that. And I think it's around one of the biggest, one of the biggest problems that we face is actually when a youngster comes out to you, one of the main things that we should do is believe. Avoid being non-judgmental, because the minute you show a young person that there is some doubt in your face, the youngster is not going to talk to you. It's all about giving them that trust and
And it takes incredible courage
Indeed.
to bring that up in the first place. What if they're not
Indeed.
bringing it up? What if they're not even broaching the subject themselves? But you want to broach the subject because you think something might be... I mean, it could be anything as simple as something's going wrong at school, they're being
Yes.
bullied or something,
Yes.
which is still terrible, but obviously
Indeed.
not on the same scale. So how do you go about... What are the kind of conversations you should be having?
So conversation around, so you realize that a child doesn't want to go to school. And I think sometimes mothers will play some of the biggest roles, especially to girls. Not to say that boys, that this is not happening to them, because like I said, it happens to all ages and all sexes. So, but I think it's about giving them that open door access whereby they can feel free to talk to you. And I think it's about persuasion and persistency, because at the end of the day, they might not divulge. They have to actually be in position to know that this is a safe environment to divulge any further information and that I'm going to get the support that I need.
And often schools are very good because, as you
Yes.
said, it often happens with a family friend or a family member.
Yes.
And understandably, youngsters are going to feel very vulnerable about whether they will be
Yes.
believed.
Yes.
So for them who are reluctant, because there might be youngsters sat there watching this thinking, they're talking about me, and I
Totally.
can't talk about it because
Totally.
it's this family member, it's our next door neighbour, and my family will never believe me. But how do schools respond these days? If there's somebody that they can speak to in schools, maybe a teacher, maybe somebody who looks after their pastoral care.
And I think these days the safeguarding is huge, is broad, and which is really a credit, and it's very positive to our communities, literally everywhere. Because at the end of the day, the schools and every health professional will have a duty to safeguard. But one of the other aspects that is happening in schools is schools have workers. They have counsellors. They have people who they can feel that they can go and talk to, and then those workers could make referrals to health professionals who actually deal with cases of rape or of sexual violence nature, where we can support them. Nowadays, we know that children don't want their parents to know in the first instinct, and what we would do in that case is work with the child and make sure that the child feels safe.
And that's the real key, isn't it? It's having that level of trust that you're
That's
dealing
it.
with professionals and they have heard it before. Yours,
that's-
sadly, will not be the first case.
And I think that's a very good point, is we've had it before, and we're here to protect you. Because if we then don't protect these individuals, sometimes they go back to the same perpetrators, and it happens again and again, and yet the long-term effect is huge than actually dealing with it at this point in time when it's recently just happened.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our second half, about the effects of not doing anything about it and
Totally.
why it's so important. So thank you very much. We've got lots more to talk about. And again, we've said all the way through, if you want to get in touch with any of the various services that can help you, please do let us know. We'll give out our email address later on as well, but please get in touch with us or find out for yourselves of all of these great charities, including Haven, who can actually help you. Now, we must stress that should you suffer from any medical problems or health concerns, it's always highly recommended that you contact your doctor or GP, as the Health Show gives you an alternative viewpoint to the health concern being discussed. We've got lots more to talk about, lots more great advice, so we'll see you after the break. Hello, welcome back to The Health Show. Today we're looking at violence and assault of a sexual nature. Now, before we talk more to our special guest today, we're going to watch a short clip where a movie producer and mogul has been accused of sex crimes by over 80 different women. Following Harvey Weinstein's arraignment for rape, his attorney Benjamin Brafman alludes to the Me Too movement, questioning the ability to get a fair jury. Let's take a little look at that particular video and also the potential consequences.
Mr. Weinstein did not invent the casting couch in Hollywood, and to the extent that there is bad behavior in that industry, that is not what this is about. Bad behavior is not on trial in this case. It's only if you intentionally committed a criminal act, and Mr. Weinstein vigorously denies that. Mr. Weinstein has always maintained that any sexual activity he engaged in was consensual. He has vehemently denied any of the allegations which suggest that he engaged in non-consensual sexual activity. And I anticipate that the women who have made these allegations, when subjected to cross-examination, in the event we even get that far, that the charges will not be believed by 12 people, assuming we get 12 fair people who are not consumed by the movement that seems to have overtaken this case.
I mean, that was quite, it's really disturbing when you see people trying to justify, you know, we're talking there about bad behaviour and the fact that he didn't create the casting couch. I mean, it's an extraordinary abuse of power. And this is something that people often don't realise. It's not just in the home.
That's
the
right.
fact that people like Harvey Weinstein were abusing their power. I mean, the fact it's still happening in 2018 seems to me quite extraordinary that people are evidently getting away with this still.
And really, what breaks my heart, and I think to most of the times, again, because it's the position of power, this is not talked about. It's who is going to believe me? He's the head of school. Who is going to believe me? He's my boss at work. Who is going to believe me? So it's cases like that where people find it really difficult to actually divulge any information because there's not going to be any belief. But one of the things that we're doing, partly as the Havens, is we review cases, and some of the cases that we review, going back to what we've just watched, is looking at public interest. When I say public interest, is we're looking at cases where, with cases like that, where there is a position of power, head of school, even it could be head of football.
And we've
coaches.
seen lots of cases of that recently.
We've
yes.
seen, exactly. So what we can do as well, people don't realise that a lot of the times, if it's happened once, sometimes it's actually happened before, and that one person coming out to report or coming out to actually highlight what's happening is actually helping other women out there, or is actually helping other women who it's happened to it before. So that's a very good...
And it's really interesting, isn't it? We look at that, and we look at the football cases that you were talking about, where people at the time feel, you know, I could jeopardise my career, I can jeopardise my future, I don't want to come out and say anything, which is then beholden, hence the Me Too campaign, of people who are out the other side in terms of they're no longer dealing with that individual, for them to come forward, because actually they are effectively protecting the people who find themselves in this position at the moment. And it's a massive issue, isn't it, in terms of the fact that even if it's historical, you can still bring it forward.
And this is what the audience or the public out there don't realise, that actually, be it how many years a sexual assault has happened, it actually can be brought to justice. These cases are being investigated. Sometimes if it's happened, say it could be a few months ago, and it could be that there is injuries that you sustained as a result of that incident that could still be looked at. Historical cases are still being investigated, and we're having good outcomes from them. So people shouldn't be afraid to come out with that.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because it's a big issue. But we talked about how, it's almost as you need to come forward to protect people in the future, because the chances are the perpetrators are going to be doing it again. And often the authorities will look at patterns and things.
Yeah.
And therefore something that might seem quite insignificant, maybe
Yes.
it was just flirtation or something,
Yes.
but you reporting it can make a
Yes.
massive difference to other people. Maybe have you got any incidences where actually they were able to put, without obviously breaking any confidentiality, but
Yes.
there was, over a period of time, there were patterns that actually, when it was all put together, all of a sudden something came through, that people realised something terrible was going on.
Because I think one of the things that is highlighted, especially, there's something called modus operandi, where there's a pattern in which a perpetrator is going to target victims. And a lot of the times people don't realize that the information that is going to be given to us is very crucial, because the pattern in which a suspect is going to target an individual could be exactly the same pattern that he's going to use if he's going to another victim. So we collect all that information, and all that information sort of comes together, and we put two and two together. The police is very good at, it's called mapping. So all that information is mapped up differently to actually come up with a suspect. There's been cases that I've known about, but this happened a few years ago, where this was from youngsters who, I think the area was around Croydon area, where youngsters were being eluded into being made beauty, I think it's like modeling, something like that. So the perpetrator was doing it from one client to another, and they didn't realize. So that we were keeping the links of what's happening, and I think there was 3 cases of the same type that came together from these youngsters.
And sadly, the chances are it was probably a lot more than that, where people, abuse their power. Let's talk a lot more now about the confidentiality. I don't think anybody would be under any doubt how important it is to come forward, whether it's about you, whether it's on behalf of somebody else, especially a youngster. Give our audience some indication of the level of seriousness with which these cases are taken now, and the fact that they are talking to experts, and the fact that it is confidential. Maybe put people's minds at rest a little bit there.
I think every health profession out there would work under the confidentiality law, and we are bound to confidentiality for every patient who comes through the door. And I think people out there are times when confidentiality is going to be breached, but that confidentiality is going to be breached by health professionals purely because of reasons that warrant confidentiality to be broken. But this doesn't mean that actually every person who comes through, we are confidential. Usually lines are confidential, and we can't support people, and people can actually talk on a one-to-one without anyone else sort of getting, because one of the things that people worried about is, are you going to tell my GP, or are you going to tell? Yes, we could tell your GP, but with your consent. And even if we divulge some of this information to health professionals, they are also duty bound by confidentiality.
And that's particularly the case within the Muslim community, often where there's a stigma about going outside of the community.
Yes.
And knowing that you can speak to somebody of your own gender, or a gender that you prefer, the fact that it will never get back to the people within your community unless you give your consent. And that's a massive issue, where people just need to trust. And maybe people, aren't familiar with the way things work in Britain. They might just not be convinced by that.
People are not quite clear, or people are not sure of how much confidentiality is really a key to health professionals. It's massive to us, because breaching someone's confidentiality is huge, because it's had lots of consequences with that. And I think within our communities, we know that your GP knows your husband, your GP knows your sister, your GP knows your colleague, and people have this belief that my information, suddenly my next door neighbor is going to know about this information of me being sexually assaulted. That is not the case. Everyone is duty bound to keep confidentiality as paramount as anything else. So
Tell me a little bit more about the Havens and what you do, because I know you're one of many phenomenal charities who work so hard at looking after people who are in often terrible circumstances. Give me an idea of what happens if somebody, say, calls you at the Havens and wants to start this process. Talk me through what's going to happen. So if anybody is watching and they're considering giving you a call, they've got an idea of what's going to happen.
So first of all, we are a 24-hour service. Be it that the only time you have, the only space you have is going to be in the night, please do give us a call. Even if it means that in the morning, in the middle of the night, do give us a call. So it gives you that sort of leeway that you have that time. So the Havens 24-hour service, we are, like I said earlier on, we are confidential, okay? We are confidential, but any person who calls through for support and service is listened to like anyone else, and we give you the advice to the best of our knowledge. Like I said, we're here to believe you. We're the best service that someone, I'm not saying that we're the best service in terms of sexual assault. There's so many other services out there who are dealing with this type of work. But in terms of the fact that if something is acute, it's just happened, you know, you can pick up a phone call and call the Havens and say, this has just happened to me. Can I come in at any time? It's confidential. You're more than welcome. We see people who have been recently sexually assaulted within 7 days where they can have procedures done to them, preserving evidence. We've got people who are coming in historical aspects where we can actually sign them through the prosecution criminal justice route. So because we do have independent sexual violence advocates who could actually support people through that route if they want to report. And should people want to speak with the police without giving their details, they can do that as well by speaking to sexual offences. We do have specially trained officers who work with us.
One of the things that I really like is the fact that your default is, we believe you.
Yes.
And I think that's such an important thing. And then the fact it's going to be confidential, because one of the big issues, and just stepping back a second here, is the consequences of not doing anything. First of all, obviously, you're not helping other people who might become victims in the future or right now, especially if you're talking about historic cases, which you can bring up. What are some of the consequences of not reporting? What are the sort of things that people go through if they don't deal with this, if they don't face, that proposition of making that phone call? What are some things that can happen?
I think not making the phone call, a lot of the times people, you will never know. You will never know what the service could offer you. And a lot of the times people will suffer post-traumatic stress silently and not realize that there is help out there. And I think the consequences that actually come from the abuse or from the sexual violence is huge. And a lot of the time there is a lot of stigma. There is a lot of isolation for you as an individual, and also you will never know whether actually, because then that makes it the norm to the perpetrator. You see what I mean? Because then the perpetrator goes away free and he thinks he can do it again to someone else.
And this can often lead to sort of mental illness and there's been numerous cases where we've heard of even suicides.
Yes. And it could happen. This is why I think the earlier someone gets the help out there, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it should have happened immediately to make that phone call. Like I said, even if it happened to you a few months ago, years ago, there is still help out there for people who've suffered childhood sexual abuse. And in adult, it's giving them problems as adults to actually move on. So you find that one of the disadvantages, like you asked earlier, is people can't even make a family, because...
And it's interesting you're talking there about the sort of long-term effects and the fact that you can stop a pattern occurring, because although yes, it's difficult to overcome the trauma that you might have experienced. But a lot of people you find in some of these historic cases where people almost feel vindicated that actually it wasn't anything about me. I didn't do anything wrong. This person has committed this crime against many other people. And although it can't take away your pain, at least you feel A, justice has been done, and B, that actually you're hopefully preventing that from happening to anybody else in the future.
Definitely.
And you talked a little bit there about normality, and I want to talk a little bit about the roots of this problem, where it all comes from, because so often you see it being perpetrated within a family that's not dealt with, and it almost normalizes it, so
Indeed.
it continues. Are you seeing that amongst generations almost?
We do see that, and we do see a lot of that. And I think, say, for example, again, I'm going to touch within our community, and I think what people don't realize, especially in families, people think that it's the norm people should carry on, and women don't actually know what's wrong and what's right. The boundaries are crossed very often, and they don't realize that actually there is a stop to this, that this is the point where I say no, this can't go any further. And the other point actually that I've read just before I came on here is that actually there is illegal, it's illegal now to actually marriages are performing illegal sexual activities that are going on, and people don't realize that actually it could get to a point where you say there has to be a line. Women out there don't think, and then as a result they just carry on a day-to-day basis. He's my husband, I'll carry on. He's my husband, I'll carry on. And they never know, but there are services out there that people can
and it's
speak to.
terrible the effect that can have on other members of the family. Even if other members of the family aren't being abused themselves, they see it and it almost normalizes.
That's very true, because again, you find a lot of youngsters that sometimes when they grow up, as not necessarily at older ages, within their teenage life, things like this do happen to them. But because they've seen it happen, they sort of normalize it as actually, mum's gone through this or dad's gone through this. This is actually the norm. And very often, this sort of sexual nature mimics behind domestic violence. And people don't realize that actually the two sort of come hand in hand, and people live it. They sort of justify the domestic violence and they forget this one. They sort of differentiate the two or separate the two and think actually he's only abusing me physically, this is okay. So,
and we talked before the break about the fact that, you know, often this abuse starts or can manifest itself in a very different way in terms of flirtation, in terms of, you know, brushes against people and things. At what point should people say something, you know, when something they're just not sure about is happening? When is it ever too early to report something?
I think it's not about being too early. The point is if you don't speak about it, then the person will do it again and actually thinks that you're inviting, and then does it again and again. So it's got to be to a point, if you're uncomfortable with it, if there is no consent with it, if you feel this is outside the remit where it should be, speak out. And I think this is what people don't think, that actually the police out there, I'm sure there's different areas within their organization, what department deals with what. So there could be that even sexual touching could be in position to be dealt with separately, but it's an offense. Like I said, if people don't speak out, if you're not comfortable with it, speak out, because then someone is going to think that this is inviting or this is the norm, and the act could carry on.
And it's really interesting, this whole thing of those early stages and the differences it can actually make. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is about the advice that you give people in terms of how to handle situations, how to effectively deal with something, because it's not just about dealing with the perpetrator, it's about the individual themselves, the victim.
That's right.
And what sort of support do you give them, what sort of advice do you give them to be able to deal with what's happened? You can never take anything away.
Indeed.
But how do you help them deal with what's happened?
One of the things that we do and making sure that people deal with that aspect is the fact that we're non-judgmental. We believe you. Believe every patient or every client who comes to you there's no way, because everyone's story is different, and we are not here to invalidate what someone feels is wrong. And I think what we have to do is invite them in, bring them in. There's organization that can call you in for a one-to-one. You can come in for a one-to-one. You can speak to someone online. There's so many helplines now actually where you can just talk and talk confidentially. There is helplines like that. There are times where if in an incident is recently just happened, please, 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 we can preserve the evidence whereby someone can have a forensic medical examination. Come in, have a forensic medical examination. We're talking about, and then other aspects around therapy. So there is therapy, there's psychologists, there's counselors, people who can be in position to actually talk to you.
And again, these are people who have the experience,
Indeed.
they've been there before.
Yes.
And one of the things that's always quite interesting is always sometimes practical advice about how to deal with something, especially if you are a woman who's in a very sort of male-dominated workplace. And it's almost helping your colleagues, your male colleagues, to understand the boundaries if they don't know it. And I know you give some practical advice with that as well, don't you?
Because there are cases where you find a client comes in and says, this is what's happened to me. But then again, on going back, she then comes back and says, I've heard he's done it to someone else before. So all this advice actually does help, because then, I mean, we do have group therapies, like I said, where actually there's so many individuals who are talking about the common subject, and that really helps people to actually talk about and validate their feelings within a group and sort of support them in what they're feeling.
And it's interesting, for some people, a group
Indeed.
environment is great.
Indeed.
For other people, it's going to be individual, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes,
If
yes.
you could just give, we've just got a tiny bit of time. I just want you to, in one line,
Yeah.
give some advice to anybody who's watching, who's
Yeah.
in some doubt about what to do next.
Really, the best thing is there are services out there. People will listen. Pick up a phone call. Services are confidential. And help is out there. Help does exist.
Brilliant. And if in doubt whatsoever,
Yes.
call.
Call.
Thank you very much
No
indeed.
worries, thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank our guest, again, Nurse Rashida and Namasisi. Amazing, all the information she's given us, and thank you for all your work you do at the Havens. That's
Thank you.
absolutely wonderful. Now, once again, we must stress that should you suffer from any medical problems or health concerns whatsoever, it's always highly recommended that you contact your doctor or GP, as the Health Show gives you an alternative viewpoint to the health concern being discussed. If you'd like any further information about this or any of the subjects we've been discussing on the show, please do email us at healthshow@islamchannel.tv. And again, don't forget, it's always confidential. But for now, it's goodbye from me, and see you again next week. Assalamu alaikum.